Always fascinates me the way an audience knows when it's time to shut up. Good evening, folks. Lovely to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Mark Stephen. I'm going to be facilitating the Q&A session later after our lecture tonight. Welcome to the 45th annual TB Macaulay Lecture. It is presented by the Macaulay Development Trust, who, as many of you will probably know here, fund research into the sustainable use of land and resources. And it's kind of co-presented by the James Hutton Institute, who is Scotland's foremost interdisciplinary research institute, regularly benefit from that funding. So it's a nice wee virtuous circle. The idea of the lecture tonight is very simple. Find a leading voice in their field. Listen to them and then ask intelligent questions. There's going to be two ways of doing that. We can do it old school, so we've got microphones here. We will, if you want to stick your hand up, we will get a microphone to you, okay? The second option is to do it on your mobile phone. And basically there will be a Slido, you'll get a sort of QR code, download the app, and you'll be able to type in your question from there, okay? So, before we actually get started, I have to do some necessary housekeeping. Fire alarms, there are no fire alarms scheduled for tonight. If one goes off, it is for real, run away. Don't go too far, because we need to be able to count heads and check everybody is outside and not inside, okay? Mobile phones or electronic devices, please switch them to silent. If it goes off in the middle of a lecture, you have to stand up and to do an embarrassing little dance. So you want to switch it off just now. Toilets, just out to the back there and to the right. And as I said, questions after the lecture itself, either old school, hand up, or do it on Slido. Now, to make a few opening remarks, I'd like to welcome to the stage Gillian Martin, MSP, who's the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Energy. So, ladies and gentlemen, Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Mark. I also want to thank Professor Campbell and the Macaulay Development Trust for inviting me here to open the 45th TB Macaulay Lecture. The Macaulay Lecture is instrumental in bringing people together from a huge range of backgrounds to stimulate much-needed dialogue about current environmental issues. And what a treat you have in store tonight. We've got a wonderful opportunity to hear from Professor Gretchen Daly this evening. Professor Daly has made a major contribution to our understanding of humanity's dependence and impact on nature, and to pioneering a systematic approach for valuing nature in policy, finance, management and practice around the world. Professor Daly's work in the topic of our lecture today is particularly important to me in my role as Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and to the Scottish Government as a whole. Our National Strategy for Economic Transformation makes clear that working with and investing in nature is a top priority for Scotland's wellbeing economy. Protecting and enhancing the natural capital that we have here will be absolutely key in achieving our environmental and economic policy goals. We have a long-standing commitment to a natural capital approach to policy. We have a natural capital indicator as part of our national performance framework, and we include natural infrastructure in our infrastructure planning. And we're investing in nature-based solutions for climate change throughout woodland creation, peatland restoration, but we need to do and we want to do so much more. We've also shown international leadership by hosting the first World Forum on Natural Capital and by organising natural capital discussions as part of the 2021 Climate COP in Glasgow, and by joining the WeGo partnership of wellbeing economy nations. But we know that public sector commitments simply won't be sufficient by themselves. Responsible private sector actions and investment in Scotland's natural environment will be essential if we are to tackle the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. So I want to use this opportunity to highlight our forthcoming natural capital markets framework. Our framework is going to set out actions that we will take to deliver our market vision for responsible investment that contributes to a just transition, community benefits for the people that we serve, and robust environmental outcomes. And it will act to strengthen our existing interim principles for responsible investment in natural capital. We all know that the collective challenge of meeting our very necessary net zero and biodiversity goals, and doing this in a way that is fair and just. We need to draw on good practice and expertise from across the world, and with this in mind, I look forward to hearing about some of the ideas that Professor Daly's lecture to you tonight will no doubt generate in the future. I thank you for the opportunity to join this event, and I'll hand over now to Joe Moore, the Chair of the Macaulay Development Trust, who will introduce Professor Daly. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for sharing the Scottish Government's policies, ambitions and indeed challenges in this climate and nature crisis. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Macaulay Development Trust and the James Hutton Institute, welcome. For I and my fellow trustees, the annual TB Macaulay Lecture is a highlight of the year. The lecture's prominence in the lecture circuit is undoubtedly due to the quality and international preeminence and reputation of our speakers on topics that resonate with so many. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Gretchen Daly as our speaker to this, the 45th TB Macaulay Lecture. Amongst her many senior roles, Professor Daly is co-founder and faculty director of the Stanford Natural Capital Project and director of the Centre for Conservation Biology at Stanford University. As well as other esteemed bodies, Professor Daly is a fellow of the US National Academy of Sciences, while her many international honours include the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2020. An awakening is in play as to the value of nature as an engine for well-being and prosperity, and to the risks and huge costs of its loss. I look forward to hearing how humankind can move from this awakening to meaningful actions. Please welcome Professor Gretchen Daly.
Well, first off, I have to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate just the passion and extraordinary, love of the land, of the water, of nature in Scotland, and I've been feeling it these couple of days here. I should also say everybody wishes me good luck before I come up, and so I hope that's not a signal to anything, coming along at the end of the lecture. But I'd like to say, we'll open a conversation tonight about a topic that I'm sure resonates deeply with everyone here, and a topic to which no one really has a definitive answer. We're in a super tricky time, as we all know, in the course of human history, and so I'd love to just have a good dialogue afterward here in the big room or out, maybe more informally at the very end. So yeah, thank you again for coming, and let's just dive in. It's what I'd like to do mainly is relate kind of an arc of impact that has been building over the past few decades to address basically a fatal flaw with our economic systems, and that is that they're completely blind to the values of nature. And this flaw is something we all know we need to fix before it kills us. And we are in a small window of time where we're seeing dramatic change in our own lives and can see the change coming toward our children and their children. And it's just stunning. I'm not planning to get into the statistics and all. I'm sure you've heard through different research reports and David Attenborough and others how even if you look at a metric as simple as the weight of all the land mammals, and you ask what fraction of that weight of all land mammals is wild, constitutes, wild animals. It is just a tiny fraction today, less than 4%. It's hard to imagine, and the rest is, people and our livestock. And there are many other statistics I could give you. I've worked mostly in tropical forests in my life, as well as up in mountainous areas, similar to here in Scotland. And I've seen dramatic change, and I don't even consider myself very old. But the question is what to do, and I've been really heartened to see that in the climate arena, however much, uncertainty and stalling there is, many, many leaders will say now, I really get climate now. I get it. I know what I personally want to do, and here's what my organization is committing to doing. Whereas when you get to something like biodiversity or nature, natural capital, however we express it, most leaders that I encounter say, I get that there's a bit of a problem, but I really don't get what I should do about it, nor what my organization should do. So that's something that's beginning to change, and what I'd like to relate tonight is mainly a set of stories as to how things are changing, and hopefully get your reactions and guidance on how to propel this movement further. And just in starting off, I guess I want to emphasize that throughout, there isn't sort of any one way. There's often, I guess I like to see things in dualities, but different paths that we need to follow concurrently. So at one level, we need to develop an approach that can work globally and help halt and reverse tropical deforestation, say, in a beautiful landscape here in Costa Rica. But at the same time, it has to work, very locally for local people and involve local communities in a win-win kind of, with win-win outcomes. And similarly, what I'd like to get into to start off is kind of a duality of pathways where on the one hand, we're addressing the emergency, confronting our economic system on its own terms, financializing aspects of nature that we might feel a bit uncomfortable quantifying in economic terms. But at the same time, we need to drive long-term a much deeper shift in our cultures. We need to drive a deeper awakening as to how interdependent we are with nature. And I'll just show a few photographs taken mostly by a friend and colleague who is someone I occasionally write little books with, and I've been waiting to write a next one with. This Charles Katz. So just thinking about our home in the cosmos, just taking a step back before we dive into all these stories. Thinking about the beauty of this place where we find ourselves living life together. It's thought that there's something like 2 trillion galaxies out there, a mind-boggling vastness. Our own galaxy, the Milky Way, is thought to have something like 100 billion to 400 billion stars. Just taking that in is really profound. Our own star, the sun, has its 8 planets. And this one, Earth, has a biosphere. It's the only one known to have a biosphere, a complex web of life living at the surface in that thin, thin layer. And we're part of that. All of our lives will play out in this thin layer, in this one planet. All past human lives have played out here, and all future ones, as far as we know, will play out here. So it's incredible to take this in and then to recognize that basically until the next asteroid hits this thin layer, it's people more than any other force that will dictate the future course of known life. So thinking about that, I have found it just immensely gratifying to try to address this problem, to consider how interdependent people are with nature, whether living today in modern times or in ancient times, whether living out in wild landscapes or much more in urban or heavily managed landscapes, whether living in destitution or living among the very rich. We're all completely dependent on nature, and we have a profound effect on the future. We, in sort of Buddhist or other Asian philosophical terms, are in interbeing with nature at every level. Just our own bodies are made up mostly of cells of non-human organisms, 10 times more than of human organisms. We're a walking ecosystem, each one of us, and our health depends very much on that interbeing. There's studies showing that kids who can play in playgrounds with actual soil as opposed to those ground up rubber tire mats that are now being put over playgrounds, and actual trees and things have much better immune function than otherwise. And there are many other ways in which we exist in really intimate ways with nature. And I love seeing the joy and some of the human emotions that come through deep experience with nature, and seeing how this awakening happening more and more across our cultures today is propelling action into what we all have to agree is really an unknown future, but with many bright spots popping up, including in a country where in the West it's often a shock to hear, including in China, where the entire country is undergoing a transformation. It's unclear how it will play out, but there's deep commitment at the top and all the way into many, many communities to shift out of the Industrial Revolution and to drive into an ecological civilization. This we're seeing in all parts of the world. I also work extensively in Latin America, where this one tree here has been threatened by different people and forces in this little community down near the border with Panama, this ceiba tree, a sacred tree in many traditions, and yet people have saved it. Somebody has fought to save that tree over the many decades and centuries. There are many deep wells of knowledge that people in Western and more, quote, modern societies are now tapping into. We see that in California, across many other parts. It's a struggle, but one that is advancing in really helpful ways. We're seeing, sorry for the tea there, but deep wells of commitment among people like this person, Memo, on whose farm I've worked for about 20 years, tracking the roughly 200 different bird species, about 80 different bat species that, are part of the farming system. And he's cultivating about 100 different things on his farm, mainly selling the coffee, but using the 99 other things. Stewardship. This fellow, Danilo, was a infrastructure engineer for the area and built most of what you drive over and many of the main buildings in the local town in southern Costa Rica. But all along, he's felt pangs over the orchids that get knocked out of trees that are cut down in the way of this infrastructure development. And he's had this garden in his own little backyard where he's rescued the orchids, helped propagate them, and restored them in other forest. And it's all about changing the course of history. And what I'd like to do is just dive in now to a future path. What does it look like to value nature in decision making. What does it mean in pragmatic terms? Who's involved? How does it play out? And we're just seeing the beginning of all that, so I will give you a taste of progress and then love to open up to conversation. Just remembering how special our home is and how we really need to help in every way we can move along this new dawn. So the dawning started in some ways, we could say. I'm sure the story would start differently in different places where we might have this conversation, but a lot of it started at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences when a few people, many more than those recognized here, but a few people, especially led by some economists, here Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize. 5 of his students won the Nobel Prize in economics as well for problems he set them on. And just an incredibly inspiring and humble human being who died just a few years back, trying to integrate ecology and economics. We all, at about the same time, saw popping up around the world and completely independent of any academic work, some people really driving experiments that have proven tremendously successful and that have spawned a lot of scaling. An example is here in Costa Rica again, a country that had basically as a reputation being the poster child for planetary destruction. They had the highest deforestation rate ever recorded, and they had basically wiped out most of their forest, with the World Bank insisting on it, and other parts of the economic forces that they faced, just driving those choices. But there's a team of people there, led especially by Alvaro Umana, who ended up sharing in the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace between people and nature, as well as across people of Central America at a key time in the 80s and 90s. He and others invented this first ever nationwide system for paying people to protect or restore forest for these various benefits. And when the program was first launched, they thought, okay, we'll pay a tiny amount, $50 per hectare a year, thinking they'd just get a few lunatics to sign up and kick the thing off and they could work the kinks out of the system. But it ended up being vastly oversubscribed and has remained so all these years. So it's an ongoing program. There's been some evolution, but it remains a tremendous success, and the country has reforested and is now at over almost 60% forest cover, and they aim to get a little bit higher and then stabilize. And they've done so very strategically, and many other countries now are trying to emulate this example. Another one that came up back then, how many of you know New York City and where the water comes from? So a few hands. Basically, New York gets all of its water from an area about 100 to 150 miles north of the city. And that water had been kind of the envy of every mayor, just crystal clear and clean and healthy. But it suddenly began dipping in quality with the emergence of cryptosporidium, giardia, other pathogens and pollutants entering the water. And the city faced a choice, basically, of first, of course, they looked at building a filtration plant, a large bit of infrastructure that would have cost $10 billion, or $6 to $8 billion, but about $500 million per year to operate over a 10-year horizon. And that huge price tag led them to look into the alternative, namely paying people in different ways, such as see the tent on Dave Hawley's dairy farm on the left. That solar heated tent is replacing the really beautiful old New England barns where the animals tend to be really unhealthy. They're dank and dark, and Dave Hawley said, he had to call the vet in at least once a month, if not more often in the winters. But with that tent, he had never needed to call in a vet. The animals were much healthier, and their health is intimately connected to that of people downstream. And they don't really filter the water for New York. They have these enormous fish grates that prevent, logs and other things from clogging the pipes, but the water runs pretty much straight into your cup in the city. So making that choice, investing about $1 to $1.5 billion into the watershed area has proven tremendously successful and is also a model that's being adapted and adopted elsewhere. Leading to 3 winds, that's the upper watershed, up that green blob in the upper left with the 10 million people living and working in the city down below. And it wasn't rocket science. They got it done pretty quickly once there was this shared vision and agreement. What are the 3 winds? Obviously, the downstream people are getting healthy water. The upstream people are getting recognized for stewardship and rewarded for the kind of stewardship that enables their business to continue, but also produces this public good. And finally, sort of, would you rather spend a romantic weekend away up in the beautiful New England Catskills Mountains or in a filtration plant? Many other benefits are being secured through this way of thinking and this approach. Another place you might have heard of, Napa, California. It's a famous wine growing region. I went up there with a journalist to have a look around because I'd heard of this interesting investment going on. And it was tremendously disappointing. The bakery was shut down in the town of Napa. Not only that, every shop was shut down. No one in the town had been able to get flood insurance for more than a decade. And indeed, there'd been many disasters, a huge, $1 billion in damages. Many people lost their lives and lost their property. So the town realized they could invest similarly in natural capital approach. This was thanks to, I should say, it's often just one person, like that guy Alvaro Umana in Costa Rica, or there was a couple people involved in the New York case that really led it, that poured their lives into this, but brought many others along. And here it was a writer who had lived in San Antonio, Texas, and seen a different kind of project, but with similar features along the river that runs through San Antonio, and a grad student in civil engineering who had entered Berkeley to study infrastructure to prevent flooding and realized that natural infrastructure actually might do the job much better. And they teamed up, helped conduct this analysis, brought in the US, Army Corps of Engineers, and the town voted to pay more, the $200 million, through a local set of taxes for the outcome on the right, the natural capital approach. And it's become a massive success story with restoration of all these wetlands, quite a lot of changes that are considered very un-American, to move bridges and tear down beautiful old buildings, but most of the town had been really languishing and all the buildings were kind of rotting away, not able really to be used. And the place has become really vibrant, and natives to the town are extremely proud of this new way of thinking and this new approach. The last place I'll get into in more detail later is in China. And here, around the same time, all back in the mid-90s, and they faced a massive drought in 1997, followed by the most devastating flooding that we've ever seen in modern times. And this flooding was traced to deforestation, allowing, basically after each dynasty turns over in China, the losers have been pushed up into really steep parts of the country to eke out a living. And it's, trying to make a living on these vertical slopes that what really exacerbated the flood risk. So these people, about 120 million households, were enrolled on a voluntary basis in this program to pay them not to farm on steep slopes. And there were many other dimensions to this. You could imagine just talking politics here in Scotland. Well, what are they going to do with their time and labor and things like that? There's a long story to that program, and it's another one that's still going. All of these are still going. It's been fine-tuned over the years, but it's considered a huge success in both reducing flood risk and other biophysical objectives, but also in the social and economic objectives, providing and opening alternative livelihoods and a much better kind of harmonized approach while allowing these places to basically be reforested with deep-rooted trees and things that help hold the water and the soil in place when inevitably the monsoonal rains come each season. So this is the bit of a foundation, and could somebody please wave at me as to how many minutes I have? Usually there's more of a timer, and I think right now we're on course to end around midnight, but if anybody wants to go before, if somebody could wave the time at me, that would be nice. I don't know if anybody maybe none of you kept track.
Going 25 minutes.
Okay, so somebody can wave when we get close to the end. So the idea, after seeing a lot of these examples back before I had kids and I could travel the world quite freely, now my youngest just turned 20 and moved to Madrid, so I'm traveling again, and this is my first big trip since coming out of that phase. But the idea is to systematize a universal approach that lets us all value nature in some common way, but with local nuances, with the culture, with a way to adapt the approach to local situations, but having a common language, given how globalized our financial system and economic systems are. So how do we do that? We first started into some of the science, and I'm just going to show two super quick examples to say at one level, it takes me back to the deep wonder and awe that we can all share, I'm sure, in how complex ecosystems are and what a delicate balancing act we're all playing if we manage or try to manage an ecosystem as a farmer or other producer on the land or in the water. And here, this is Costa Rica again, just trying to figure out, how to make it doesn't make sense for a coffee farmer. What you're looking at is coffee plantation with a bit of banana interspersed in it, and then on the left, a little dot of native tropical forest with a stream flowing through it. Would it ever make sense? Why do farmers keep any of that forest, and why would they plant more? So trying to quantify these values of rainforest to farmers, looking at coffee, we decided to look into pollinators, the bees, the birds and bats that might help control the pests on coffee. There's a really important pest, the coffee berry borer out there. And it's a very iconic crop. We've probably all enjoyed some coffee recently or watched our partner enjoy coffee while we sipped tea. But at the same time, these honeybees are in decline around the world for different reasons. Question is, can native wild bees do the job? And where do they live? And is protection of their forest habitat enough to help incentivize reforestation? So the short of it is, all the pollination happens literally in 1 week. In that upper left slide, you see sort of popcorn like flowers on the coffee itself. Over 9 months, it turns into those red berries, and those are picked and processed for our enjoyment. And what we did was just look at the levels of pollination and yield, different distances from forest. So this was back before we had really nice satellite imagery. We just had some air photos of this region where you can see in gray we're on the farms, and there's the forest up there. And we expected the bees to fly out, maybe a kilometer or so, but not beyond that. And we found, with a lot of experiments on coffee plants different distances out, that being near the forest actually created a yield boost a massive yield boost of 20%, also an improvement in quality of 50% in the beans, and an income boost of $60,000 per year to this one farm, which amounted to about 7 to 8% of the total income. And that's huge. It's something that, you know, most people are just not thinking about or aware of, and I bring it up just to raise the question. You know, we live on the planet with about 20,000 different bee species, all doing things to help maintain wild and cultivated ecosystems. And when we bring all that together, it might make enormous sense to protect. Same with the pest control, and just showing you briefly the story, that little beetle, just a couple millimeters long, is a terrible pest wiping out coffee crops all over the world now. And there are all sorts of birds in the system. If it's a lower intensity coffee system like this royal flycatcher, here's the female version. They're not happy being caught, but fly around and we keep good track of them. And this beautiful red-legged honey creeper, all sorts of birds that eat insects of that size. And then things like this bat. I had to show the most spectacular one. It doesn't eat little insects, but rather eats the birds in the system. That's the biggest bat in the Americas and the largest carnivorous bat in the whole world. And we caught it, you can see, right by a coffee plant. So we set up these exclosures to see if we excluded bats or birds or both, would that reduce, how would that change yield? Would it, lead to pest infestation inside the exclosures? And indeed it did. I'm going to give a longer story short, but out all across the landscape, we and a huge team of locals set up these plots to quantify the pest control benefits. People motorcycled around before dawn and then just before dusk to raise and lower the different bits of netting to let birds in the morning and to exclude, have the exclusion with only bats in at night and that kind of thing. So I'm raising this partly to say how complex it is. We're never going to uncover the financial value of each benefit of nature to people. So we need a system where we just kind of have an understanding of some of the lower bound values. But we found, we even tested with a lot of different birds, feeding them this little pest and seeing what came out the other end and whether we could easily detect then. We caught and released many thousands of birds and detected through lab analysis later, how much of the pest the bird was actually eating. And the bottom line is that being near forest reduces pest infestation by 50%, at least in the couple years in which we were running this, thanks to birds. And with bats, it's a more complex picture. They're much more active in certain times of year and certain weather conditions. But the bottom line is that whatever we're doing out on the land, we're connected with all these ecosystem processes and benefits. And there have now been thousands of studies over the past couple decades trying to dig into the nitty-gritty of these many services. And we're trying to take the studies, go from studies to actual transformation of our economic decision-making systems, from the kind of plantation you see on the left, which is still very common, and to more of one on the right, a Rainforest Alliance certified plantation. I'll take you really quickly now into another realm just to be considering as we think about an ecological, civilization for all of us. And this is the urban realm where more and more of humanity, as you know, there are these three trends. We're becoming an urban species. We're so disconnected from nature and cities. Came up today, kids in the more polluted areas questioning whether there even are stars because they've never seen a star. spending much less time in nature, kids having almost no nature experience. And even in smaller cities, that's sadly more and more true, with kids much more indoors on devices. And associated with all that, a real uptick in anxiety and mood disorders that has been connected mechanistically to the lack of contact with nature. And I'll just show you one experiment so you get the idea of how this sort of thing is done. This is from my home university. The psychology building is in the background of the picture on the upper left. That's a little bus that goes around and delivers people to different places. And we got volunteers to come in, take a bunch of tests in the psychology department, kind of mental acuity tests. I'll show you one. Take a shuttle to walk either along this busy street. It's hardly a megacity street, but a busy 6-lane street, or walk in this more natural area, both about 10 minutes away, and then come back and take more tests. And it's incredible. Here's how the test works, so pay attention. Want to see how you do. So you sit in front of a computer and you're asked these math problems, and they go by quite quickly. And what you need to do is answer true or false, and then you need to memorize a letter that comes after the math problem. And you can't just blow off the math problem. You have to get at least 80% right to qualify for the study. So true or false, remember the letter. 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 Come on. What were the letters? Just 4 there. And it's incredible. I didn't like playing this game myself, but look at the difference. If you look at the y-axis in number of letters remembered before and after, at least the urban walkers on that little urban street, at least we didn't harm them. They came in distracted and stressed after having to park on the campus, and they left distracted and distressed and didn't remember letters very well at all. But the nature walkers, and they hardly went to Yellowstone, it was just a little path and some trees that any city could have in it. They remembered, on average, 10 more letters than the people that walked on the busy street. And we see this now. There have been also lots and lots of studies here in school kid performance. It's both the cognitive functioning and the emotional well-being. And I'll show you one emotional dimension called rumination, when we sit around regretting, and thinking about aspects of ourselves we wish we'd stopped thinking about, or dumb decisions we've made in the past, that sort of thing. Might look something like this. And so we actually scanned people's brains, and we found that those who had taken the walk on the sort of busy street, compared to those walking on the nice path, there was a massive difference. At least we didn't hurt the urban walkers, thankfully, but those that walked in that bit of nature, we made them walk longer. In the first test, they walked for 50 minutes, 50. In the second one, it cost a lot of money to scan their brains, so we made them walk for 90 minutes to get an effect. We didn't want to kill them, but we wanted to see an effect. So look at the change in blood perfusion into the part of the brain where it's known that we ruminate, the part of the brain that gets very active when people are ruminating, and that's associated with risk, of onset of depression. So there are a lot of studies that altogether show improved working memory and mood, reduced anxiety and rumination, and many other benefits of experiencing even one tree. It doesn't have to be as beautiful as we have here in Edinburgh. Just a few trees in cities could make a massive difference. And what I'd like to get into now in my remaining 3 hours is the scaling and mainstreaming. How do we bring this into practice? And there are a couple of keys, I'd say, and I bet there are many more that you all hold and I'd love to hear about in conversation. One is just to make the science accessible and actionable. Most people could never read those sorts of articles. I can't read most of them myself in the relevant areas where we want to know about all sorts of benefits of nature to people. So what we've developed by collaborating with about 150 research institutions in very close partnership is a software system that lets you illuminate on landscapes, on waters, where nature is generating benefits, how much, and where they flow. And we have all the expertise sort of embedded in there, supported by a data platform with all the data you need to then answer questions like what's involved in shifting to green agriculture. The sort of chain of thinking involves looking at the possible change in management or policy, how that would affect ecosystem structure, maybe adding trees along stream sides in farming areas, changing function, better filtering water, retaining the water, reducing flooding, changing services, the actual benefits to people by providing better quality water, maybe improved agricultural yields by keeping soil healthy and on the land, and avoiding treatment costs and other impacts to people. So that's kind of the thinking, and it's all embedded in the software, the layers of data, the models there in the middle, and then maps and other ways of visualizing and valuing nature, often not in monetary terms, actually. And most of this, decision makers want to see how many people are affected, maybe what the costs and benefits would be of whole projects, of taking one pathway or decision versus another. But it doesn't come down to how much was each bee worth on a given farm. And we're seeing this taken up all over the world. All countries have been using this software and basic framework to some degree to inform decisions in a lot of different contexts shown here. And I'll just highlight a couple. One is in water security, replicating that New York example, which had been advanced elsewhere before, but to achieve security for cities, food, energy, and especially rural livelihoods, to create more dignity and engagement and recognize the stewardship of rural people and providing many different types of benefits. And showing, where to target investments, what kinds of change you need. Fantastic, thank you. And okay, you guys, we're going to end earlier than. And where in the watershed? It's thousands of square kilometers. Where do you invest to achieve an improvement in either water quality or maybe the timing of flow to avoid floods and avoid dry season scarcity? So here's an example from Colombia, where in the Cauca Valley, each of those purple blobs is a watershed where each drop of precipitation, flows down toward the valley where you see the highway in yellow in all those cities. Here's one of the cities, Tuluá, and the watershed projected with the ridge top at the top. And you can see that the software modeling lets you see where to protect, where to prioritize investment. Basically, what's the portfolio of investments you'd want to make in protection, reforestation, adding trees to pasture, fencing animals away from waterways, or enriching with understory to help trap more nutrients and hold back sediment and soil flux, especially right near the streams. And then lets you see sort of what the return on investment would be at different budget levels. So we're using this in lots of cities, that don't have huge budgets. What could be afforded at different budget levels, and what would the payoff be? And we're seeing this really taken up. It took some years to get going, quite a few years, I'd say. I saw the first of these big investments around the year 2000 in Quito. And then the cool thing is that a bunch of the people that worked on that in Quito, a couple key people intermarried with people in Colombia. Quito's in Ecuador. And that led to literally about 15 of these so-called water funds being established. And then across Latin America and with the Inter-American Development Bank, that's the president of it, the guy talking, Luis Alberto Moreno, until a few years ago, really took off with this approach and helped scale it up with the trust, I think, across different institutions, even at that family level, making a big difference. We're seeing this growing in Africa, and there are a whole bunch of them taking off across China and many other parts of Asia, and starting to open in the hydropower sector especially as well. I'll give you another example. As you know, there's intensifying frequency and severity of storms. And many places, by the way, are just living from one disaster to the next. You sometimes ask, well, can we really afford this? But when you're just being pummeled by disaster, you realize there's no choice anymore. Many places are at that point. People are not just sort of paying with dollars to deal with disaster. They're unfortunately paying with their lives. So that has created a real shift in the development banks that I'll get to in a moment. But with these major storms, here's just to get your mind going a little more how the software works on some of this. Looking at, say, the Bahamas, it's not that intuitive as to where people and property are most at risk if you're standing on shore or boating around. It really depends on details of the bathymetry as well as how storms tend to come in. But this can show the hazard level and where you'd want to invest in restoring or protecting seagrass beds, mangroves, coral reefs to shield people and property from their effects. And you can see that island, the Andros Island, right in, with the real-time satellite imagery that we can get through Planet and other high-frequency, high-resolution images. We're doing a training at this moment in the in the Prime Minister's office. And literally a couple weeks later, after a plan had been decided upon, a huge hurricane came through and indeed validated the models, sadly, but this is just a reality there, and it's going to become a reality more and more elsewhere, and that's one of the things propelling uptake of this approach. So Belize, shown here with one of the Natural Capital Project former postdocs who has become a senior scientist on the left, and the CEO, Chantal Clark-Samuels, from this Belize Coastal Management Zone Authority, working together over about an 8-year period, harmonizing the planning of all the ministries working out along the coastline and off in coastal waters, from oil and gas development to major cross-oceanic shipping to tourism and recreation, nearshore fishing, and a lot of onshore infrastructure and such. And all of that using this approach has led to plans that have really motivated investors, and they're getting massive investment now in their NDCs, all these pledges that countries are making, and into restoring ecosystems for immediate and local benefits. So it makes the climate, getting on board with global climate action, much more palatable because it's very well aligned with what local people want and need now. So IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, is scaling this up. And finally, I'll tell you briefly about China, where we've seen, like I mentioned, real horrific disaster play out, and the government now, for many reasons, partly having a lot of engineers actually planning things and guiding ministries and that sort of thing, take a very systematic approach to driving this transformation in the near term toward an ecological civilization, and on that dual track, the much longer term that I'm not showing right now. But it involves, first, this China ecosystem assessment. The UK is famous for doing a fantastic one, and a couple years later, published in Science, China came out with theirs with just a huge number of ground truthing sites, over 140,000. Now it's over 200,000. And they're running this every 5 years, mapping out exactly where food is produced, carbon, soil retention, the sandstorm prevention, all these benefits, and the biodiversity itself is always prioritized as a capital asset, something to protect in its own right without looking precisely at what benefits are coming from it, and at importance levels. And this is guiding all land planning now. So China has zoned the country to prioritize these services and benefits with biodiversity at the core there as an underlying kind of part of the nation's heritage and assets to pass on to the future generations. And then within any of these zones, there are local plans that detail 25 or 30 other benefits that people care about and specify in their own planning. And so you can imagine for any place, this is an easy one to imagine, where you're going to zone for the regeneration of biodiversity and where more of a focus on farming. But in every landscape, this is going on, and there are about 200 million people now being paid as stewards to bring back the biodiversity element while maintaining some levels of farm production as well. And a lot of this is now being captured in a new metric called GEP, Gross Ecosystem Product, that's really catching the imagination. So just like GDP on the left, it's the sum total of all the goods and services that are produced by ecosystems, multiplied by some meaningful measure of value, and summed up. And it's a work in progress. You can see mental health is in parentheses while we advance the science a bit more before bringing it in. But this is being used all over the country in many different mechanisms that we wouldn't think of necessarily here to guide investments from the downstream beneficiaries to upstream stewards. So there are three main purposes: to illuminate the contribution of ecosystems to society, to guide these investments across regions, and we could well imagine this across nations at some point, but definitely across provinces in China as a battleground and a key frontier. And then tracking performance. So it's being used now by Belize and other countries to track performance on sustainability-linked bonds and things. And it's just an accounting system that I won't detail, but very straightforward and allows you to see whether things are working out as promised or whether there's some problem preventing, the regeneration that's wished for. The UN approved this, and now it's making a lot of headlines, and a lot of countries are starting to pick it up beyond China. And the MDBs, it was amazing, in Glasgow, all agreed to propel this movement, mainstreaming nature throughout their operations. And we're seeing now just an effort to scale further, and an experiment where our team is being given 16 countries to work with over about 15 months, and do so in batches to see, well, what projects and capacity can be built, or launched and built in each of the countries over time. And it's all sorts of things that I won't read out to you, but you'll recognize. And the MDBs finance this. So it's the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, together with some more regional banks that together are propelling this. And I'll just maybe touch on one and then close. And it's Chile really stands out for actually reorganizing its government structure to enable more coordination and to elevate natural capital. They're one of the countries that has been really tasting disaster with extreme drought, extreme heat, and extreme fires, making Santiago, which had been a pretty livable place, into a searing desert with a lot of dying forest. And they're elevating this natural capital committee that sits above the Ministry of Finance, of Economy, and Environment to help coordinate this process of bringing the values of nature into the front lines of planning, policy, and finance. And that's the team of people working together right there. And so much of it ends up being little groups like that in meetings, and then going out and really trying to implement. So I won't get into detail, but there's so many countries driving so many really innovative projects and bringing in cultural elements that make the kind of reignite traditional parts of culture that harmonize and relate very well to all this. And finally, I'll just show you some of the tools for illuminating an area we haven't made as much impact in yet, but where we see a lot of signs of change in investment. So this is in the private financial sector, looking at asset management companies. We worked with Morgan Stanley, trying to bring all this global modeling of something like nitrogen retention and water quality, for example, onto Bloomberg screens is the idea. And we got asset locations for about 3 million assets just to play around with an approach with some very passionate people at Morgan Stanley. And you can zoom in with this imagery and see anything, what's going on. We looked at lithium mines because we thought we'd see a lot. Developed ways of quantifying impacts and dependence on biodiversity, water, coastal protection if it was an asset near a coastline. And then you can model quite readily the change through time as assets shift in their direct footprint and indirect impacts. So this is the kind of thing that's coming with some of the transparency that's really being pushed here in the UK and EU. And it lets you just identify companies with lower impacts and help encourage companies, have everybody see what's coming, the knowledge of impacts and dependencies and risks in different sectors. So with that, I'll just close by saying again, it's an incredible time in which we're living, and it's amazing being on this path together, and trying to change from this path is really something that is almost heart-stopping, but it's also really gratifying being able to enjoy these days in Scotland and learn a lot more about the struggles and successes being lived here, and about the possibility for linking arms across the world and really trying to advance this movement further together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You want to sit in the middle seat?
Okay.
Gretchen, thank you very much for that. Judging by the mental arithmetic tests, none of you have spent enough time in the outdoors. I think I would have to be locked out of the house to get half of those. Even given time, I couldn't remember half of them. We're going to have questions fairly shortly, but first can I ask to the stage Dr. Kerry Whalen, who's the senior researcher for the James Hutton Institute, to give her immediate response to Gretchen's talk.
Thank you very much. Well, that was pretty awe-inspiring talk, Gretchen, so thank you. I'm not going to go on for too long, because I know that you really want to ask questions to the lady over there. But I thought I'd just use the opportunity to pick up on a few things that are happening in Scotland right now, to add to what the Minister said earlier, just to kind of give some sense about what we are doing, and maybe provoke some thoughts about where we could go further and what else we could be doing. So the Minister covered quite a lot of the stuff that's been endorsed and is happening with the public sector. And there's really great things happening, like you see natural capital mentioned in the strategy that's framing some of the agricultural reform. And this is great, because this means we're not just seeing natural capital as the thing for the tree huggers, but actually it's that thing that's starting to get embedded in other policy areas and other domains, which is super critical, this idea of mainstreaming. Nature's something that we all need to be thinking about. And also we see efforts to encourage private sector involvement. Sometimes perhaps we do have some stuff happening that maybe we're helping with this challenge of getting private sector involvement happening in Scotland. So we've got efforts to get nature restoration teams, getting them investment ready, and also we're seeing, perhaps for better or worse, we're also seeing people coming in and buying land or working with land managers in Scotland, asking them to do things differently. The third sector is also really active in this conversation. So the Scottish Wildlife Trust, for example, are amongst those who are helping to shape the debate and think about what it means to work with and value our natural capital. And of course, academics and research. And I think at this point, I should look down at my notebook. I've got a long list. I don't know if we have time for the whole list. But just to pick on a few things, just very quickly, some of the kinds of science that are relevant to this. And some of it does use the INVEST model, and that has been used in Scotland, and that has then shaped some of the things that we do in conversations with policymakers. But also we have research doing where to plant the right trees in the right place, how to predict how our landscape assets are going to be shaped by climate change, how do we elicit people's really complicated relationships with nature and present that in some kind of format that's actually intelligible to others and usable in decision making, how does green space help menopausal women, how do we understand how the carbon gets locked up by soil, how can we best restore peatland, how do we best intervene in our catchments to reduce flood risk. And that's just a really random list of stuff that we do in my institute, and I know that in other institutes and other universities too in Scotland, and I'm sure I've offended many people by leaving out other things that I could or should have mentioned. But what's really interesting is that Scotland is a relatively small country, and that's a big strength for us because that means this work is often done in conversation or in partnership with people from different sectors. And this, I think, is something that we can offer in Scotland, and I know we're not unique in this, there are other small countries, of course, but we have the Scottish Forum for Natural Capital, we have I can't keep up with Basecamp, it's this online forum where people are sharing ideas and talking about things that are happening, and I've learned so much through being on it. I chair the Sustainable Land Management Connectors Group, and it's just been really eye-opening, helping to kind of bridge these gaps that often exist between sectors. By itself, it doesn't solve any problems, but it definitely helps us to share the learning. So that's what we're doing, that's what's good in Scotland. But of course, it's not utopia here, and we know the state of nature is still declining. We know that not everybody likes or relates to the idea of the term natural capital. We have concerns about some of these new practices that might be associated with that label, green-led, greenwashing. We don't all get time in nature. We have a lot of social deprivation. We know, what we saw last week, funding cuts for the nature restoration. So it's really difficult to protect the resources that we have for nature and to make them work for us, let alone trying to think about re-engineering and giving more resources and effort to nature. But we know we have to, and I think this is the challenge. We don't want to be in the situation of seeing lives lost and nature destroyed before we start to act. So I think this is the big challenge for us, isn't it? I'm super excited though. That's the negative, like, oh my goodness, let's try and act before we have a catastrophe. But the positive is some of these examples that Gretchen has shared. I would just love to see a natural capital committee be the boss of the Treasury down south. Anybody with me? Yes. And so there's some ideas in there, I think, and we can't necessarily cut and paste all of them, but I think we should give some serious consideration to the work that Gretchen shared and the examples happening around the world. And and I guess I see we've got some challenges that are also the solutions, which is sort of inconvenient, but so we need to persuade the head and the heart. So natural capital, I think, is often associated with numbers and data, maybe monetized values, and that's really useful sometimes, and maybe that brings some of us into thinking about these issues, but we need to make sure we're building relationships, we're doing more, we're really connecting with everyone's relationships with nature. And we need to kind of act now, despite the fact that we never have enough data. Even in Scotland, where we're so lucky to have so much data, we never quite know what's best to do. But nevertheless, we need to act now whilst thinking in the long term. And we need to be working together, which we're already trying, but we need to be bringing more and more into this conversation. So these are both the solutions, but also the challenges, because none of these things are easy. And I see some of that resonating through your talk. And I guess it would be great to know from the audience And, you know, what are your ideas for how we fix this? Because none of us really know for sure, but we definitely have some good kind of seeds that we can grow in Scotland, and hopefully we can do more soon. So I leave it there, thank you.
Right, folks, any questions? Anybody want to stick their hand up in the audience and we'll get a microphone to you? Nobody ever wants to be the first. I know it's difficult. Thank you. Right at the very front there. Can somebody get a microphone to that? Is anybody detailed to get one? Here we go. Take your hand up again. There you go. Just pass it along. Can you identify yourself first, please, and then ask a question?
Hello, thank you very much for that. Stephanie Brown from the Landscape Finance Lab. That was wonderful. And what I'm struck by is that in Scotland we're very rich in a lot of ways, and I work a lot in the water sector. We've got plenty of water, but that's always the assumption. And a lot of the examples that you gave were countries and places where they are at massive crisis point before any action is taken to invest in the problem. So how can we encourage our policymakers, our infrastructure, our Scottish water to make more investment in nature before we get to the crisis?
That sounds like a question for one of these two. That's a really good one. A lot of these questions are hard and they're very context dependent. How to motivate action when you don't have an absolute crisis. Often there needs to be some other impetus. And I think in terms of the cases I've seen, it's often a passionate individual. It sounds very, at one level, like, oh, there's software and data and this, you just somehow see it unroll. But actually, the way you're asking the question takes me to the role of individuals as leaders, often in a community. So for example, in every case, I could have held up a photo of the key people, and maybe I should bring them in more, really behind things. There'll then be a cast of thousands in the case of China, for example. But there are two guys that have worked as partners, a mentor and student. Now the student is, the mentor just retired about a couple months ago, and the student is now taking over as director of this key institute. And without the two of them, I don't know that anything would have happened there. So it's not always to say that it has to be one heroic individual, but in every case you see heroic individuals who have committed to something for some reason that really drives them, that might be ancillary to the public aspect of water security, but linked to something that they care deeply about.
No, I was just to somewhat generalize your question, that I was watching a presentation from the wings and thinking, okay, what links Burundi, the Cook Islands, China, etc. But just from what you've said, that they've all experienced some level of catastrophe or they wanted to avoid. So you have to have the risk first, you know, the stick hanging over your head, and then the individual that goes, yep, okay, let's do something about this.
I guess that's been the case. What's happening now with the multilateral development banks trying to transform and achieve their pledge, and we have the head of the World Bank coming to my university in a couple weeks to discuss this, and things are sort of advancing. I think transforming those banks that together disperse hundreds of billions of dollars per year, through most of their history, that has been in the name of planetary destruction more than anything. And there have obviously been big benefits, but looking back with hindsight, we can see how little regard there was for nature and how tragic the consequences have been in many places. And with them transforming and trying to bring a lot of the private sector investors along. There's possibly a pathway in places that haven't yet really met disaster because they'll need to abide by these new approaches.
Yes, so social networks matter, but we're not always married to the right people to have that link to the board member or however, but trying to get influence in those spaces where the conversations are first being considered, where the options are first being thrown around, that's the really tricky thing. And then also then using formal mechanisms, as you mentioned. So freedom of information requests, thinking about the different sectors of society, so the media can be really important for bringing attention to an issue. You know, water pollution in the UK, that's shot up the agenda, and that's partially because it's got so much coverage in the media. So, yeah, if you don't have the friend in higher place, then I guess thinking about other ways that change can be achieved. And the existing links and the formal accountabilities can be quite important. So in the case of Scottish Water, you mentioned, they're accountable to another organisation. So thinking, well, what, you know, could that regulator be influenced? Could pressure be brought to bear? And great that we have, you know, great access to information in Scotland and transparency commitments. So there are kind of means to sort of get the information that might help others to kind of know who to speak to and what the issues are. Because I know, yes, so much of it seems to be about charismatic individuals, but that puts a lot of weight on those individuals to save the world, and also for those of us who maybe would like to, you know, convert someone else in a position of importance or influence. That's quite a difficult thing to know how to start sometimes.
If I understood the drift of the Natural Capital Project correctly, part of this is to create a syntax, a language, a universal language, which can be easily understood not just by environmentalists but by CFOs and accountants and, you know, and all the rest. There's a question here that I think cuts to the heart of it. Andrew Miller saying, if companies cost their nature impact and it wipes out their balance sheet, will they keep looking at this issue? That's an existential question right there for any company that looks at it and says, yeah.
Well, they're probably likely to well, hopefully, they would change their business operation, because you think, well, we don't have a business, this isn't going to be, we could keep it quiet, let's not tell anyone. But they'll know that this isn't going to work, because presumably they've got a supply chain risk, or their infrastructure is going to be wiped out because it's in a flood risk zone. So, I mean, I'm going to assume that most CEOs are not going to sit there and go, okay, let's just hide out that information and let's hope the bad stuff doesn't happen.
You know, I think they just keep going as long as they can.
I don't think most of us wake up in the morning seeking to do bad for our organisations or for nature.
But we're very good at telling ourselves stories.
And we're quite good at procrastinating.
Yep.
Yeah. I could say there that we've worked with about 25 or 30 major corporations directly. And in every case, there's been real uptake of the approach, and it's been without, you know, complaining or grousing. It's seen as actually very informative. So an example is in mining, working with Rio Tinto in different countries, their license to operate depends on, you know, having government approval. Obviously, there's a lot of corruption as well. I'm going to put corruption a little bit to the side. But we've worked in cases where they wanted government approval and sought us out to help validate that their approach to mining lithium and other of these newly highly valued metals for the energy transition and stuff would be okay. And they, yeah, they implemented a whole approach that's an amazing story in itself. You could look, it was in Mongolia. If you want to look on our website, we even have a video on this particular project. And they've adopted it more widely. We worked with Unilever and developed a new life cycle analysis for product design, material sourcing, and kind of supply chain management, really knowing where the risks are in supply chains. We focused initially, I was super happy, on Ben & Jerry's ice cream packaging. And it was whether to package it with petroleum-based plastics. This was a little bit before all the plastics work, so about 10 years ago exactly, actually, or bioplastics. And we developed, a whole way of looking at the impacts of these different approaches in different parts of the world, sourcing the biofuels, bioplastics, feedstocks, and stuff like that. And the company took it up, and they apparently are quietly continuing with it. And we did 2 other projects with them, same thing. Same with Dow Chemical, a huge company with operations all over the planet. They took it up at a vice, presidential and then CEO level and use it. But the big problem we found with companies actually is it's very hard to scale across an industry. And they'll use things in a way that benefits them in the immediate term, but you might want to go a lot further with the transformation, and they're not so game to come together and cooperate the way the banks are proposing to do now.
So just to maybe add to the examples, so just to bring it back to Scotland again, the whisky industry is quite an interesting one, and of course there's some very big companies there like Diageo and others. But some of those are looking really seriously at their exposure to nature-related risks and investing upstream in catchments to protect the water supply, because you need Scottish water to make Scotch whisky, but also thinking how can we protect our infrastructure at risk of flooding. Lost the ability to speak. So you do see companies changing, but of course that maybe tends to be the big ones who have perhaps enough capital to think about reinvesting it and enough sort of specialists to reflect on these issues. And then the challenge is then how does that filter down or affect other smaller companies? But you do sometimes see follow my leader effects. So a pioneer does something and sort of maybe invests a lot in it, and then other companies which may be sort of not quite so innovative or not willing to take the first leap look and follow. So there are some kind of nice examples out there, I think.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Do you want to stick the hand up? So double check so that we're not taking everything from slides or something there just behind you.
Thank you. I'm an elected politician in Scotland, a councillor. I think I'd start off by saying Scotland's a very small country. We've got less than 500 people own half of the landmass in Scotland. It's not a mystery about our land mismanagement, our peat bog degradation, our overgrazing with deer. So we know exactly what the problems are, and we know exactly what we have to do with it, and there's a lot to do with political will and general will to tackle the problems. We know what the technical solutions are. But I think I'd like to hear your views on the role of the state, because as a local authority councillor, me along with my fellow councillors and 31 other local authorities are looking at adaptation plans for our areas. We've done risk assessments on flooding. We're looking at nature-based solutions. We're developing nature networks to try and, because we know that whatever happens, if we reach the target of net zero by 2045, we're still 1.5 degrees warmer. So the temperature's changing. So we are all working very much on the nuts and bolts about what do we have to do to protect this catchment area, to stop this city being flooded, to deal with overheating in our hospitals. And we will be looking for large-scale investment to actually do the work on the ground that we need to do. So have you got examples of where the state has led that investment and where the state has encouraged private investment into that zone, because that's what we desperately need? And I don't know how they get their payback, but we either have to have a polluter pays principle where we find the people who are causing the problem to put money in the pot to fix it, or we have to have another way of making sure the capital that's invested is repaid. But we need to get on with it, and we know exactly what we're meant to do. So
have you any examples of that, Gretchen?
Well, you're asking a tough one, and I appreciate the story you laid out. And I guess one thing that inspires me is that the US is finally getting on board with this. So over the various decades, there have been kind of participants from the US, but not so many examples. But just this past February, actually, the Office of Management and Budget agreed to a policy and basically requires all federal investments to undergo a natural capital cost-benefit analysis and look at who benefits and how much, and whether, for any federal agency, any project must undergo this analysis as to what the implications are, bringing in the values of nature. So that, if really implemented, and a lot will hinge on a debate that I didn't watch last night and the outcome of our election, but that could make a huge difference in the US.
But the lady's question basically is, how do you get to that point? How has this happened? Why has this happened in the States?
Yeah, in many ways, for decades, people just like you were standing up and posing the question just as you did. And it was extremely frustrating, and it might still be that way. It's hard to know what's going to happen in November and beyond. And I think all I can say, I would love to hear what others say, is that sometimes it seems all one can do is help further ripen the time and work where it's possible and implement demonstrations that will be inspiring of others and kind of change mentality. Maybe I'll say one last thing here. It's a friend of mine, an investor who's from Brazil, launched a very successful and enormous investment firm in Brazil, and actually has just moved to London, and I'll be seeing him in this. He's helping to run Just Climate now, which is based in London. He said two things. First, when I was asking him more or less the same question, first was that famous quote by Gore Vidal, "Nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come." And what we're seeing around the world is maybe that time actually has come. And then secondly, he's trying to save the Amazon. I mean, imagine how frustrating and excruciating that would feel, especially when you see so much of it is being liquidated for burger production to the US. But his quote there, he's trying to implement all sorts of better policies and practices in the Amazon. And he says it's basically, I was asking what the main barriers were, and he says it's just breaking prejudice. There's so many prejudices when you get out there and you see people's views, and we all have them. I'm sure I am loaded with them. You know, you have a certain way of looking at things, and you don't realize that actually this other vision could work out beautifully for you and for the things you value. And it's, many farmers and ranchers in Brazil, don't think a tree will ever grow on their pasture, or they don't think they can continue any livelihood if they plant any trees. It's just step by step trying to shift people's mindsets, and it's a matter of trust and those sorts of more social dimensions of all this and the deeper shift.
Maybe I could give a response, which is just to maybe ground this in some specific things. Insurance companies. So there are European countries, depending on how flood insurance is organised, where insurance companies have become a major force for investing in catchment-based solutions. And that hasn't happened yet in the UK. I don't know how the situation is in the US or the other contexts you've worked in. But potentially there is a lever we could pull there, but it would come back to changing how insurance is organised. But there are countries where it's local authorities that you kind of work through your local authority, and then the local authority works with the insurer. So those are positive examples that things could be done, but not easy, instant examples, I realise. There's an example down south that gets a lot of attention, the wire catchment, W-Y-R-E, and there, ultimately, the public sector still has to pay, but the upfront cost and the risk is borne by impact investors. So that's sort of thinking about upfront costs versus long-term costs. But that perhaps is something that's perhaps a little bit easier to see, that maybe that example could be borrowed closer to home. And then some of it comes back to how the public sector maybe accounts for itself, and there are, again, tools that could be used, but perhaps aren't mandatory but perhaps should be, because then that would mean that the spending decisions, cost-benefit appraisals, those kinds of fun subjects, they would tend to kind of value the nature-based solutions more often.
You kind of get the feeling that the Scottish Government are interested in this. The Cabinet Secretary earlier was genuinely gutted that she couldn't actually stay for Gretchen's presentation, but she's asked to see the video. That's promising in and of itself, you know, even if it's just one small step along the way. We have tons of questions sitting on Slido that I genuinely don't have time to go through, so I apologise if you've taken the time to type a question and we haven't actually asked it. There's going to be a reception immediately after this, so presumably you don't mind being buttonholed, do you?
I'm looking forward to it, sir.
Good, excellent. Well, that's fine. But before I give my thanks, can I ask to the stage Susan Davis, who's the chair of the James Hutton Institute. It's a long walk in silence, isn't it?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to offer a vote of thanks tonight. As you've heard, the TB Macaulay Lecture is one of the longest-running public science lectures in the world. We're grateful to Joe Moore and the trustees of the Macaulay Development Trust for both their continued support of the lecture and of the wider Hutton's scientific endeavours to find solutions to pressing global challenges. A huge thank you to Professor Gretchen Daly for a most thought-provoking, insightful and entertaining talk, and also for embracing the wider programme of engagements taking place during your visit. We're sorry we've not quite lived up to Californian sunshine, but you have at least seen some Scottish sunshine. Can I please accept this gift as I pass the microphone as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Also, thank you again to the Cabinet Secretary, Gillian Martin, for setting out the Scottish Government's thinking and approach on natural capital, and to Dr Kerry Whalen for both providing a Scottish context to Gretchen's lecture and outlining the research being conducted at the Hutton on this topic. You can keep informed of wider Hutton work through the Hutton highlights, our blogs, social media and the website. My thanks also to Mark for his excellent facilitation of this evening's proceedings, and to the team behind the Hutton scenes that put so much effort into arranging this event. Finally, my thanks go out to all of you, both here and online, who have joined tonight. Gretchen has given us much to think about, a message of hope combined with real success stories where natural capital approaches have been embedded into and framed societal changes. It is people who make the real difference. So I encourage you all to reflect on the lecture and think about what you can do to help support the transformational change that is required. It only leaves me now to encourage you to complete the event feedback survey that will be issued tomorrow, and also to hand back to Mark to close proceedings. We hope you'll join us downstairs at the post-lecture reception. And thank you again, everybody, for participating, and particularly to Gretchen. Thank you very much.
If you join downstairs, you can partake of this
Do you not drink like?
climate positive gin with me.
But have you got climate positive tonic to go with it?
Yes.
It's not, I mean, many of you here will know what I do for a living, but it's not often that you are at an event where you get a genuine sense that things are tipping, that there is a change out there, and it may be to do with the syntax, it may be to do with the thinking, but it's getting traction, and it does actually offer some light at the end of the tunnel that's not an oncoming train. So thank you very much for coming here this evening. Can I ask you to thank one more time, please, Gretchen and Kerry. Thank you. If you didn't manage to get your question answered, there's the reception downstairs. Thank you very much, and safe journey home, folks, if you're not staying. Thank you. Right.